Well, it's now 10 o'clock, Neil, and I'm very glad that you could join us, and thank you for coming. And I'll just let you get right in with your talk now.
So yeah, I've got my two logos in here. So I'm Neil Alexander. I run my own company, Bucephalus Consulting. And as Richard and I were talking about earlier, the reason it's called Bucephalus Consulting is that Alexander the Great's horse was called Bucephalus. And so there's a little bit of a connection there. And then more recently, working with a colleague, I've just set up something called Let's Talk Nuclear, where we're trying to bring people that are talking about nuclear issues around the world together to have the opportunity to discuss where they're successful and where, what lessons they've learned from their nuclear communications, to see whether we can improve them and perhaps encourage more people to get involved in talking within their communities about nuclear, as it is a much misunderstood and sometimes distrusted technology. So the name that Richard gave to the presentation was a Canadian perspective on management of used nuclear fuel. And that was the issue that I wanted to talk about. And then as Richard and I have talked, he has suggested that a bit more of a grounding on what's going on in Canada and what its nuclear industry looks like would be helpful. So I'm going to start with that and then move on to some thoughts on used nuclear fuel. But I've also retitled it slightly in that I felt that saying a Canadian perspective implied that I was somehow speaking on behalf of Canada, whereas I'm actually speaking on behalf of myself. So it's a Canadian's perspective. And then as soon as I wrote that and said, well, I'm going to give a Canadian's perspective, I realized that my accent might confuse people. So if you haven't read my biography, then yes, I am a Canadian. I've been here for 20 plus years now, and I'm a Canadian citizen, but I was born in the UK, and that's where my accent comes from. A little bit of background to nuclear in Canada. We do consider ourselves to be a nuclear nation, but it's quite concentrated. So here's the picture of Canada. We have 4 operating stations at the moment. Well, 4 operating sites, 2 stations at 2 of the sites. So there's Bruce A and B. Bruce A and B is the largest set of nuclear stations in the world. That's Pickering, which is about to be retired. And there are 2 stations there, 8 original units there, and that's been slimmed down to 6, as 2 have already been closed, and the remaining 6 will be closing, I think, in 2024. And then we have Darlington, most recent stations, 4 units at Darlington, and then out on the east coast in New Brunswick, we have a station called Point Lepreau, which is a single unit station in New Brunswick. The other 2 that are identified on here are 2 closed stations, NPD at Chalk River and the Gentil Candu unit that was in Quebec and was retired 3 or 4 years ago. Nuclear power in Canada provides about 15% of all of the electricity in Canada, and it provides typically about 60% of Ontario's electricity. So within the most industrialized province, it's providing the heavy lifting that has allowed Ontario to become a manufacturing province. I say that because people get quite fixated on just the cost of nuclear power, but they don't look at the consequences of it. And basically, without plentiful electricity, Ontario would have remained a relatively poor farming community, but with plentiful electricity, originally initiated by Niagara Falls, but then with the vision of people to say we need more if we are going to develop as a province, that's where the nuclear power stations were built. Ontario not having easy access to any gas or any coal, and therefore having to find its own way. It has meant, interestingly, that Ontario has one of the cleanest electricity systems in the world. I like to suggest to people that we should be using it as a model for greenhouse gas avoidance in the rest of the world, rather than some of the other countries that use a lot of intermittent renewables, who have struggled to achieve the same objectives that Ontario has managed to achieve with its nuclear fleet. The Canadian nuclear stations are all what we call CANDUs, and Canada has been reasonably successful at selling CANDUs to the rest of the world. So we now have CANDUs operating in Romania, Pakistan, China, South Korea, India, and Argentina. Most of those are what we call the EC6, which was a design that we were able to use some of the modern concepts of replication and actually replicate as we built from one place to the other, ending up with the very successful projects at Qinshan in China. That everybody says nuclear is always overspent and delayed. Both of the projects there were brought in significantly ahead of schedule, allowing their customer to start generating electricity and therefore generating money much sooner than they had originally expected. So some great success stories for the industry in those projects.
Could I interrupt for just a moment, Neil? Diane DeVos has a question. I've asked you to unmute, Diane. If you could just pop a quick question to Neil. Are you there, Diane? Can you unmute yourself?
So I was saying to Richard beforehand that I've just put some sort of facts together and run the presentation from that, but I'm very happy to be interactive and to take questions as we go along, if that's what people want. And the way the presentation is designed is we can go off in a variety of different directions if there's a particular part of the subject matter that people want to investigate.
I agree with that plan. I think it's a good one. And Diane doesn't seem to be able to unmute herself, or we're not catching.
No, so
we'll let that go for now.
And Diane, if you want to interrupt at any point, then please do so.
Okay, very good. We'll carry on. Thank you.
So I thought I'd give you a little introduction to the CANDU reactor, because it's quite different to the pressurized water and boiling water reactors that you typically saw in the United States. So it's instead of having a pressure vessel of any kind, it has a series of pressure tubes that run through a calandria, and they are horizontal pressure tubes. This allows a number of things that we'll come to in terms of the advantages, but that fundamentally is the big difference between a CANDU and either a PWR and a BWR. The rest it looks pretty simple. You generate heat by boiling water and putting it through steam generators and then creating electricity that way. It does mean, though, that you can do a number of different things. So one of the things is a CANDU fuel bundle, the picture of which is at the bottom left there, is much, much shorter than a PWR's fuel string. So I'm going to be very precise about this. It's about that long. So very easy to handle, and we'll come to one of the advantages that wasn't planned but is going to be beneficial to us when it comes to used fuel disposal. The picture in the left there is the front of the face of a CANDU reactor, showing all of the pressure tubes running into the calandria. So those are all then connected up to the cooling water supply in order to keep the fuel cool, and of course to extract the heat and produce the electricity. So that's the basics of a CANDU reactor. It has a number of advantages. So because it's horizontal, you can get a fueling machine at both ends of the pressure tube. And that means that you can go for online refueling. So you don't need just to cut off the electricity supply to shuffle the fuel around, but you can just push a fuel bundle out from one end, push the whole line down, push it out the other end, and then insert a new one at the front end. So you can shuffle fuel constantly, and that is how they do it to maximize the efficiency of the machine. Because it uses heavy water in the calandria and in the pressure tubes, it means that you can use a natural uranium fuel, which means you don't need to upgrade the uranium in any way. And in fact, it's the CANDU fuel is ceramic uranium oxide pellets, just again being very precise, that sort of length, that are inserted into the bundles. Not upgrading has a number of benefits. One is it makes the fuel a lower cost. The other is that if you are in a nation that wants to have fuel security, but doesn't have the capacity to upgrade uranium, you can still have a nuclear reactor program and just buy natural uranium and make your fuel out of that. A couple of other advantages. Because you're building fuel tubes, there is no large pressure vessel of any type. There is no large retaining wall that has to be produced, and you can do everything in much smaller manufactured items. And because you have many, many pipes, you have the capacity for things to go slightly wrong without having a significant effect on the reactor as a whole. So you're trading off having one pressure vessel where, if something goes wrong, you lose the integrity of the whole pressure vessel, into having very many pipes, and that the photograph to the bottom right shows you all of the pipes that are entering in to allow the water flow over the fuel.
Can I ask a question at this point?
Yeah.
You mentioned the fact that it works at normal pressure, which is great, but the reason we started to pressurize our light water reactors was to increase the efficiency in the temperature by pressurizing from 100 degrees centigrade to 300 plus, and why that apparently isn't necessary with heavy water. Can you explain that a little bit?
No, sorry. If I said that, then I misspoke or misled you. It is pressurized, but it's in pressure tubes rather than pressure vessel. So each of the tubes is pressurized, and so the system is pressurized, but it's going down a series of tubes rather than in one vessel. Okay.
My other question I was going to hold until later, but since I've interrupted you, I'd like it if you would explain to us at some point why the NRC, if that's the main obstruction to its being used in the United States and elsewhere, why the NRC didn't approve of such a thing. It seems to me to have enormous advantages, and I'm a little puzzled as to why it seems to be a Canadian thing only, plus the people who bought from Canada.
Well, so there are a number of different answers to that question, depending upon who you speak to.
Yeah.
So the Canadian answer is that the Americans wanted to protect their own reactor designs and not allow a Canadian one to be able to compete in America. That may or may not be true. The more official answer is that the NRC took a very prescriptive approach to regulating reactors. And that those prescriptions did not enable the Canadian approach to meet with the prescriptions that they had set down. Okay. So that they would have had to have gone back and changed all the regulations to allow a CANDU.
Thank you.
I suspect it's a mixture of the two.
I do. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
The one provided an adequate excuse for the other, and although they perhaps didn't mean to do it, they weren't uncomfortable with it happening that way. You'll appreciate that I come from a country that developed Concorde and is still smarting from the fact that America wouldn't allow it to land at their airports for a long time.
Yes.
That we undoubtedly believe was a conspiracy.
Another little interruption. I'm hearing some background noises, very strange whirring, whining noises. And if anybody has their speaker on, it would be nice if you think there's that noise in the background to shut it off. It's a bit disturbing. Thank you.
Oh, I have heard people complain about my system that after a time it starts to make that noise.
Oh,
So
okay.
I'm going to try while we are talking and put headphones with speakers in and see if that's any better.
So you're the culprit.
Possible that I am the culprit.
Yeah, okay.
You will also hear my dog bark shortly. Because
Yeah, we heard that too.
it's
That's okay.
jealous.
We'll accept that. Those are, you're the speaker, you have extra clout.
Does that sound reasonably good?
I have to, your volume is quite low. Can we turn it up a bit?
I think I need the microphone close to me like that. Is that?
Yes, I think so. Yeah, and
Okay.
it's still a little bit low. I have you full volume on my computer.
Well, is this better than it was before or worse?
Yes, yes, that's good now.
Okay, I will do this and see what happens.
Good.
So that's basics of the CANDO system. The key to CANDO, which allows the use of the pressure tubes and allows the use of natural uranium, is heavy water, which allows the moderation of the neutrons to take place more effectively. It's heavy water is deuterium oxide, a rarer form, so it takes a lot of effort to make heavy water, but it does mean that although its effectiveness in terms of moderating neutrons is less than regular water, curiously enough, but it is less absorbent of neutrons, so its efficiency of neutron use increases, and that enables you to use the natural uranium because you have the heavy water. Now, the story behind the heavy water and the use of pressure tubes rather than large vessels is a twofold story. So the one that is well known is that when Canada was planning its nuclear program after the Second World War, it did not have the capacity to make large forgings. So it couldn't make the pressure vessels if it designed a reactor to do them. And in fact, Canada still does not have the capacity to make the large forgings that would be needed for a pressurized water reactor. But we also benefited from something else, which people don't necessarily mention, but which enabled the program. And that's that we had plenty of heavy water in Canada because that's where all of the Allies' heavy water was left at the end of the Second World War. And it was created here and managed here in order to keep it safe from Hitler's bombers, which is why we have a research lab at Chalk River at a relatively inaccessible place. But it did mean that we were enabled in the use of heavy water as a result of that little historical glitch and allowed us to move forward with a CANDO style program.
Wonderful little hitch. I love it. One other little question. As I understand it, light water reactors consume only about 2% or 2.5% of the enriched, lower the enrichment by about 2%, and therefore utilize a very small quantity. With the heavy water reactors, how much, if there's no enrichment, how much can you use that uranium before it's required to replenish it?
Yeah, I don't know the precise answer to that. I think that the issue is more around with the CANDO. You can shuffle fuel in a more efficient way. So you can manage the situation more effectively.
But it would relate to the waste, because with light water reactors, the waste is 97% future fuel, whereas the waste that comes out of CANDO reactors must be considerably.
No, it's still in the same order of magnitude. So
really?
Okay. You are still burning up only a tiny fraction of the usable fuel.
Okay, thank you.
And the reason for that is that when fuel has to be moved is a complex set of criteria, but you get gaseous buildups within the fuel tubes. So
Xenon.
yeah, indeed.
Yeah.
So that creates pressures, and so you have to move it before
Okay.
those pressures are reached, as well as creating poisons in the fuel that absorb the neutrons and therefore lower the fuel efficiency. So it's a complex set of criteria that at the end of the day means that most existing fuels are all in the sort of 95% energy remaining in the fuel that you can't get at with the current reactors.
Thank you. Good.
And as you know, there are now a number of schemes that are looking at how we can avoid that, and indeed how we might use existing fuel and recover it in such a way that we can use the goodies from it.
Good. Okay.
So that's I think I've outlined where Canada was in terms of what reactors it's got and how we got there. This slide is just sort of give you a feel for what's going on in Canada at the moment. So the one thing that we're doing is the pressure tubes within the reactors have a design life which is much lower than the design life of the other mechanics of the reactor. So halfway through their lives, we actually take all the pressure tubes out and put new ones in, and that's called refurbishment. And there is a mammoth program taking place at the moment in Canada to refurbish the Bruce Power and the Darlington nuclear reactors. And the country is spending what is estimated to be $23 billion going through the process of refurbishing those reactors.
Now, that refurbishment means replacing the tubes themselves because of possible weakness and corrosion?
That's well, it's not just corrosion; it's all of the other things that happen to the tubes. So they creep as a result of the radiation damage. They sag as a result of the radiation damage and gravity. They absorb some of the hydrogen, which threatens their integrity. So there's a number of things that take place.
And this happens after about 20 years or so of use?
I think it's more than 20 years now. Again, I would need to check on the detail of that. But it does mean that you can dramatically extend the life of the reactors. So although a lot of people say, we're not building at the moment, we are actually going through a program that is effectively the same as building, because those reactors would have been coming to the end of their useful life were it not possible to go through this process and to refurbish them and extend it.
Can you do that one at a time, or do you need to shut the reactor down for that?
They are most definitely shut down. Yeah, so they are shut down for significant periods of time. They have to be allowed to cool before you radioactively cool before you can get reasonable access to them. So they are down for a considerable time. And because they are such an important part of our electricity system in Ontario, there is a complex dance taking place as they are taken down between Bruce Power and OPG in a coordinated fashion to make sure that the province retains enough electricity production capacity to support it as the refurbishments take place. So
thank you.
It's quite important that they stick to that program, and the early units have been managed in such a way that they have been delivered on time. So again, another set of nuclear projects being delivered on time, and it's quite important that we do so. And a large expectation that we should improve the efficiency and speed up the process as we get used to doing those refurbishments.
Good.
No plans to build large reactors in Canada at the moment, but a lot of interest in small modular reactors. Some that are being developed here by Canadian companies, some that are being developed here as a project by offshore companies, both American and British at the moment. We have what is being described as a 3-stream plan. In the short term, Ontario Power Generation are looking towards trying to demonstrate a reactor that may become available in the near future at their Darlington site, where they have licensed capacity to build more reactors. And they are looking at 3 designs, and I should have made sure I could remember which 3, but the X-Energy design based on triso fuel, the GE small boiling water reactor design, and our own terrestrial energy, I think, is the 3rd, which is a molten salt reactor. In the longer term, out on the East Coast, they are looking at reactors that might recycle fuel. And there they are looking at Moltex, and the other one I'm having a mental blip and is not coming to me at the moment, but they're looking at 2 designs out there. I'll come back when I remember it and fill you in on that one. And then, so that is for grid scale applications. The expectation is that the OPG demonstration would then lead to other provinces, some of them previously non-nuclear, potentially deploying those reactors to form a national fleet based around the demonstration at Darlington, with 2 provinces expressing interest in going in that direction, one of them being Saskatchewan, from where most a large uranium producing region, but previously non-nuclear in terms of power reactors. So they are very interested in developing a nuclear program, and potentially Alberta, which has been very rooted in fossil fuels for obvious historic reasons, but is now trying to manage its way away from fossil fuels to use non-emitting sources. And they have also expressed interest in potentially adopting that, becoming part of that fleet of small modular reactors. And then the 3rd stream, so the 2 streams are that short-term power reactor, a longer-term power reactor that consumes used fuel. And then the 3rd one is the micro modular reactors that might be used at a mining site or a remote community. And there, OPG are collaborating with USNC to look at a 5 megawatt machine that could be used around northern Canada, where electricity demand wouldn't support the construction of a larger reactor. So quite an ambitious small modular reactor program. Government has started to invest money, nothing like the scale that we have seen in the US and the UK, but one that we are hoping is going to continue to expand. So recent announcements of 20 million to support the molten salt reactor that Terrestrial Energy are developing, and more recently 55 million Canadian dollars to support the development of the Moltex machine and the potential to deploy it in New Brunswick. The other New Brunswick machine was the ARC machine. That's the one that I couldn't remember. In parallel with that, there's a lot of excitement in Canada at the moment on developing a medical isotope ecosystem. So Canada has always been a leader in developing uses for medical isotopes and supplying them. You may be aware that at one point, the most commonly used medical isotope, technetium-99m, was largely coming from Canada, from our reactor at Chalk River, the research reactor at Chalk River. We don't do that anymore. That reactor closed down and we had to withdraw from that. It created a bit of a challenge for the world markets, but they have recovered. But we still have a lot of activity in medical isotopes. So there's a research reactor, 5 megawatt research reactor at McMaster University that is producing a lot of the world's iodine. And they are planning to expand the capacity there to start producing other isotopes, including one Richard and I were talking about earlier, an exciting new isotope, lutetium-177, which is being used in a very effective range of new cancer therapies. In a significant move, Bruce Power are investigating a target delivery system that would allow them to make short-lived medical isotopes in a power reactor, which will be a first of a kind. Power reactors have been used historically to produce longer-lived isotopes like cobalt-60 that are used in sterilization sources and in external beam radiotherapy, but have never been used historically for short-lived isotopes because of the challenges of getting them in and out of the reactor. But one of the other advantages that was not planned, but is now being exploited, is the fact that the CANDU does have some access points that would allow us to introduce targets, irradiate them, recover them, and produce short-lived medical isotopes. Moving to the capacity to do that will dramatically increase the world's ability to produce medical isotopes. So Bruce Power and the team that they've assembled to do that, very excited about that opportunity. We also have a large cyclotron based on the West Coast in Vancouver, and an entity there called Triumph that are producing a range of other cyclotron-produced isotopes, and they're expanding their capacity there, including looking at new ways to produce gallium-68, and they have a company there as well that is looking at selling to people the capacity to produce technetium-99m directly from cyclotrons. So it's an alternative approach that would give people security of supply for that isotope, which is much of the medical healthcare system is very dependent upon. And then the other area of excitement is the world is getting quite excited about what is being known as targeted alpha therapies. So this is using short-lived alpha emitters, and again, targeting them with molecules that will seek out and attach themselves to cancer cells. And because the alpha particle is carrying so much energy, but over such a short distance, it can be very targeted in the radiation that it produces. So actinium,
would this be californium?
No, actinium-225 is
Okay,
the exciting one.
All right.
And the world is, actinium-225, I think, is currently known as the world's most valuable material, with enough patient doses for something like 1,000 a year at the moment, where the treatment could be treating hundreds of thousands a year. So Canada is looking at methods of producing actinium-225 to try and raise that to the sort of capacity that the world might demand.
Okay.
So some very exciting developments in medical isotopes. We think it's very important to talk about medical isotopes because it gives people an understanding of radioactivity and perhaps reduces some of their fears. I always remember when I was in Saskatchewan, we were running a cyclotron facility there. We were visited by an anti-nuclear politician, and we were showing him the production capacity in the hot cell. And he kind of said to me at the end, he said, well, so what would happen if you dropped this, right? And he clearly, I could see from his eyes that he thought that somehow the world would come to an end because a radioactive material had been spilled. So I explained to him that this would be a very serious problem if we did drop it. People would be exposed unnecessarily. My safety procedures would clearly have been proved to be inadequate, would have been shut down, would have had lots of activities to recover. But I said at the end, but the thing you have to understand in terms of the real risk we're dealing with here is we were going to take that and inject it in somebody. And at which point he kind of a light went on in his mind that, yes, we have to go through all of this safety stuff, but in terms of real danger, we were actually going to put this in somebody's body. The whole lot that we were producing was going to end up in someone's body. So that kind of calibrated it for him. And I think it's important for people to understand that, because it takes away some of the fear when they realize that type of thing going on. And many people have been treated with radioactive materials. If you haven't yourself, then somebody in your immediate group will have been. It is a very important part of modern medicine.
One of the things that it's used for a great deal is in PET scans. I think that's the fluoride, radioactive fluoride that's in glucose product and is actively metabolized by cancer cells. Extremely useful in the department I work in. We had it linked with CAT scans so we could actually visualize not only the cancers, but specifically look for the parts that were actively proliferating. A wonderful test that's being used extensively around the world.
Yep. And a very valuable tool, because you will know that in a lot of cancer treatment that the physician is kind of working in the dark in terms of, I've given you this treatment, which can be quite a brutal treatment in dealing with cancers. But I don't know whether it's actually working. Where with, as you all know, with now that they have CAT scans, they can actually start seeing the effects to determine whether the treatment is working, in order to determine whether to continue with it or whether to try some alternative approach. So, as you say, a very valuable tool in terms of diagnosing.
I should add, I'm sorry to be cutting in all the time, but I should add that in case people don't know, PET stands for positron emission tomography. So this requires a special camera that detects the annihilation of a proton by a positron. And that is a very specific kind of tool, but it's coming into common use now.
Very much so, yeah. So we have, I think there are 25 cyclotrons across Canada providing those services. I think compared with America, we're a long way behind. So in America, every city will have multiple cyclotrons that will allow them to deliver that service. So, as you say, very important part of healthcare. Not just looking at cancers, but because it tracks where sugars are being consumed. You can also look at brain issues with PET scans. And of course, incredibly valuable in research, in understanding what's happening, not just for treatment with radioactive materials, but in terms of understanding the body in general. So an extremely powerful research tool. In terms of other things going on in Canada, we are just gearing up for our first major power producing station decommissioning. So Gentil 2 is a single unit station that was taken out of service and is essentially in decommissioning, although it's in still in a cooling down phase. Pickering is an interesting prospect. It's an 8-unit station that will be being decommissioned. So, that's an interesting one for the world in general. And it's also a station that is basically in the middle of a town. So it is on the shores of Lake Ontario, but the Pickering town wraps around the station. So it will be being decommissioned in sight of all of the people in the locality. And that has interesting consequences, not just in terms of the radiological issues, but in terms of the societal issues. It was a very important part of the local community, obviously a very important part of the financing of the region. So people will be studying that project very carefully, as from the societal point of view, as well as from the issues surrounding the actual dismantling of the station. And then the final program that we're very involved in Canada at the moment is siting a waste repository. So I'd like to say it's our equivalent of Yucca Mountain, but we would like to say that hopefully it's not going to be anything like Yucca Mountain. We have an organization, the Nuclear Waste Management Organization, and their job is presently to find a site in which we can build a deep geological repository for dealing with all of our spent fuel. So I thought, giving you a bit of background to Canada, my issue that we came in on this was the NWM deep geological repository, and more importantly, some of the communications around it, which the latter part of my talk is about. But if anybody does want to go into the other issues that I raised there in more detail, then either save questions for the end, or I can take them now and then move on to the used fuel stuff. I see a couple of raised hands. Richard, do you want to deal with those now, or?
Yeah, I think it would be a good time. Doug Edwards has a couple of questions here, and so did George Erickson. Let's start with Doug's. He typed one in. He says, what was the duration of the China project, and how much did it cost relative to projects in the United States or Korea?
Right, so that I'm going to be a disappointment on that one. I don't have those figures at those numbers at my fingertips. I think I know them, but I would be at too great a situation of misleading. I think what I would say is that comparing costs is very difficult, because the issues in individual countries are very different. And so, building a project in China is a very different challenge to building one in North America. So there would not be a direct comparison.
Second question, pressure vessels suffer embrittlement just like tubes. What is their useful life, and what non-destructive testing is done to ensure adequate safety margin? As you can tell, yes, Doug is an engineer.
Yeah. So the useful life is a complex factor of things. So you can't just do it in years. It depends on, temperatures it's been run at, cycles it's gone through, and it's actually the cycles that tend to be the defining. The temperature cycles from when the units been offline, that tends to be the defining factor for the end of life. As well as the amount of radiation dose they've received, that they are constantly being tested. And so, one of the things that has happened is that the original designs were very conservative in terms of the lifetimes that they put, because they were taking the worst case in order to look at the design life. Over time, we've had real experience, and we've been able to pull tubes, non-destructively test them, and destructively test them. We've got tools that go in, and there's a test called the scrape test, where they just take a slight scraping on the outside of the tube that allow us to look at the hydrogen embrittlement and issues like that. And that has allowed the lifetime to be pushed progressively further out, so that if it started at 20 years, it's been pushed out to 25 as a result of data that we have received, and being able to relax some of the controls or relax some of the conservatism on the original estimates.
Good. George Erickson has a couple of questions relating to CANDU reactors. This first question you touched on already, maybe we can elaborate a little more. Can CANDU spent fuel be recycled? If not, why not? And the other question is, can CANDU reactors use thorium? If they can, are they? And if not, why not?
Right. Okay. There were three there. So
well, okay.
CANDU fuel is not presently recycled, so we'll come to that. Presently, it is all stored, with the assumption that it will be disposed of in a deep geologic repository.
Is it not feasible to use it in let's say a Moltex Gen 4 reactor, or a terrestrial molten salt reactor?
And that's why I very carefully said not currently.
Okay.
There have been a number of schemes that have been looked at. One is because of the nature of the CANDU fuel, you can actually, without chemically reprocessing it, mechanically repackage it and get further burn up by putting it in PWRs. And so people have been looking at doing that, and they've also been looking at repackaging it for further burn up in CANDU reactors, both of which are possible. So that has been looked at, and I believe there is still a scheme running in China, but I think the challenge there is economics, that it's still cheaper to buy new fuel than go through all of that process of reprocessing or repackaging for reuse.
Very good.
It can definitely be reused and is being looked at very carefully by Maltex, where it would be reprocessed. But unlike the reprocessing of the past, where a very precise separation of the fractions is required in order to get the fuel that you need, and that has required aqueous-based dissolution and chemistry in order to get to the precision in the final product that you need. The Maltex reactor only needs a very coarse treatment in the reprocessing, and it can be done electrochemically in a much smaller area and with much less risk to the environment. So there are there is the incredible potential to change the way we go about reprocessing fuel and to make that a possibility. And that's why the money is being invested in the East Coast to look at those opportunities to start consuming used fuel rather than producing new fuel and producing the wastes from the new fuel. So it's kind of double benefit if you can reuse it.
Okay, George's last question was really a big one in the sense of, or at least it could be enlarged, but it specifically, he asked, can CANDU reactors use thorium?
So my understanding is that CANDU reactors in their current form couldn't use thorium, but the concept of using the design and heavy water would enable you to create a thorium-based reactor. But my understanding is economically, it's not seen as being viable at the moment. So there is no one developing a thorium-based CANDU design at the moment.
Okay, we'll leave that for now. Sometime I'd like to come back to thorium and your views on it in general, particularly in molten salt reactors, but we could leave that for now, maybe. Lee Gasper Galvin asks, how supportive of nuclear energy is your present government head? Do you have a movement that is something similar to the US Green New Deal in Canada?
So that's an interesting question to ask, and it's a very important one. For a very long period of time. So actually, I should specify something first. So energy is actually a provincial issue rather than a federal issue.
Yeah. So
we've got a number of governments involved. So there are the provincial governments and what their views are, and the federal government and what its views are.
Well, at least there are only 10 of them, not 50. Like we have in our states.
That's true. But I think there are, and again, not knowing this, what's going on in the States well enough, there are some significant variances in belief that in Canada, as a result of the available natural resources. So if you look across Canada, some provinces are very supportive of nuclear. So Ontario, obviously, very supportive. New Brunswick, nuclear is a key part of its system, and they're very supportive. Saskatchewan heading in the direction of being interested. But we have some provinces that are very anti-nuclear. So Quebec, that used to have a nuclear station, closed theirs early, basically because it was coming to the end of its useful life, but they took an anti-nuclear stance. Quebec has huge resources for hydroelectricity generation. So they have the luxury of being able to have a green grid without actually doing anything. And they're selling vast quantities of hydroelectricity into the northeastern US, as well as providing it for their own uses. So they have that benefit. And then we have the people in British Columbia who are also very against nuclear. And again, they have the capacity to produce lots of hydroelectricity. So they don't need to worry about where their clean electricity comes from. So it is very dependent upon the resources that regions have. Sesaskatchewan and Alberta used to be against nuclear because they had large fossil reserves. And now that they are seeing that they're going to have to move away from using those fossil reserves, that's why they're becoming more interested in nuclear. Over the last 10 years, the federal government have been supportive of nuclear, but not in a very helpful way. So they haven't done anything to interfere, but they haven't necessarily been very helpful. We are seeing a churn of opinion taking place at the moment with our current federal government making very clear statements that, in their view, we cannot decarbonize to the degree that we want to in Canada without the support of the nuclear industry. And they have now, they're saying that very clearly. They are now starting to put money into the small modular reactors. We are looking to see whether they are going to do more, because there are other actions that are needed. They have not said anything about a specific nuclear campaign of any kind. It would be very helpful to the industry if they did. So at the moment, it's supportive but passive. We need to turn that into supportive but active if we're going to make the progress that we want to make.
Good. I think that's a great answer. Yeah.
There is, people talk about this a lot. There is much more support for wind and solar. And I talk with people about this, and I say that wind and solar are very seductive technologies. The concept that there is something that is free and natural that we just harvest fits very nicely into the human psychology. So people want to believe it will work, whereas uranium is something that they don't really understand, and nuclear power is something that they don't really understand. So it's having to fight for its position against, this seduction that has taken place of these other technologies. And the thing I say about nuclear power is that wind and solar might be very seductive, but when you wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning and you want to feed your child, it's the nuclear fleet that you can rely on to be there. And the seduction, might be nice during the day, but sometimes isn't there for you to support you when you need it. So, but across the nation, we are still dealing with those issues of people would like to believe that you can do all the decarbonization that you need to with the new renewables. And that's why the government's position to say, we've looked at the numbers and that isn't possible is very important for the industry, that people are beginning to recognize that to get to where we want to go to, some heavy lifting of reliable capacity is going to be needed.
We should leave you a little time to deal with the waste issue, but before we do, I'd like to ask you to just give us a little comment on Ontario Hydro. Having lived in Fort Erie for 7 years, I've just always been enchanted with Niagara Falls. And as a kid, I remember it was just called Ontario Hydro instead of OPG because it all came from Niagara Falls. And my question to you is, what is the future of Niagara Falls? Is that hydro facility longstanding? Can those underground turbines that take half the water that would otherwise go over the falls, is that got a 100-year future, or is it going to have to be decommissioned at some point? What's the longevity there?
Oh, excuse me. They've actually just been expanding the capacity from Niagara Falls by digging some more tunnels. I
Great.
can't remember whether it's completed or not, but I would say that the Niagara Falls resource is such a tremendous resource
Yeah.
that it will last forever, right?
Good.
Things may need replacing, but they will be replaced.
Yeah. Does it now provide, would you say, about a third of Ontario's energy or more?
No, it's less than that now.
Okay.
So I think it's probably less than 20%.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah.
Just because Ontario has grown since I was a kid there, and the nuclear has filled in that difference.
Because Ontario's grown, its power demands have increased, and nuclear has been taking up the capacity.
I understand that you have no coal in Ontario, which just thrills me, but I gather that there's still some methane being burned somewhere, or is that not true?
That's correct, yeah, but it's mostly being used for peaking, which
Okay.
is, if you look at an electricity system, then using some methane to deal with to give you the capacity to deal with peaks is really economically beneficial and not desperately harmful to the environment, because it's not running all that much.
Right.
So,
well, as I understand, you have to keep it spinning though, the turbine. So that does consume some methane, and of course, it is a powerful greenhouse gas, any that leaks. So it's a problem. But
yeah, I think cutting down the leaks would be a good thing to do, because that's beneficial to no one.
right.
I think my position on that is it would be nice to be able to get rid of them, but actually they enable so much that if you had to spend a lot to get rid of them, you could probably have spent that money better doing other things. So,
okay, I'm going to be persistent in quizzing you, because as I understand, hydro is also a pretty good peaking, even as well as a baseline. Is that not true?
yeah, hydro is, but you can't always rely on your capacity on hydro. So Niagara Falls is pretty reliable, but some of our other hydro dams, they can dry up during the summer and not be accessible when you need them. So having that controllable reserve is still pretty useful. Yeah, so it's challenging. I think it's challenging. It's the law of diminishing returns with electricity. As you get to those final bits, then suddenly you find, having something that's in your control, relatively inexpensive to build, is useful capacity to keep in your system. So I think it'll be a while before we get rid of it.
Okay, I will hold the last question from Mark Corwin, but you can maybe work it into your discussion as you move on. And his question is, how can the world help the general public relate to the positive aspects and the safety of radiation through their exposure to medical isotopes? That's you sort of addressed that, but you might want to elaborate on that as you work into the rest of your talk, okay?
Yeah, should we come back to that one? Because that opens up a discussion about how we communicate it, about nuclear in general. And I think this kind of leads into it. So,
yeah, I think so too. Good.
So let's do that.
Okay, very good.
So I thought I'd talk a little bit about used fuel, and we've talked a fair amount, and I will come to this later on, but I want to address it right from the start. I'm going to be talking a lot about a deep geologic repository for getting rid of used fuel, and I believe it is essential that we get on and get that issue resolved. The reason why is, one of the big points that anti-nuclear groups will bring up is they'll say, you still haven't dealt with your waste problem. Mm-hmm. And so we want to be able to say, well, yeah, we have. And the frustrating thing, I think, for people in the nuclear industry is the reason we haven't dealt with our waste problem is that we don't need to. Right? If it was really, really dangerous and we couldn't look after it, we would have dealt with the problem. Yeah, but the fact is, although it is dangerous, like many dangerous things, it's actually easily handled. And so as long as you provide appropriate shielding and you have a mechanism for getting the heat out of the fuel at the rate that is being generated, then you can look after it very easily. And actually, unlike almost every other primary effluent from a fuel production system, used fuel in North America has caused nobody any harm and has not done any environmental damage. I mean, it's actually quite a tremendous record. Now, it is very radioactive material, and if it's not handled correctly, is dangerous. And it would be nice to say that we have managed it by getting rid of it completely, which we could do by using it in these alternative reactors that we've talked about, and we're looking at doing it. But the fact is that they're so energy intense that even if we built those reactors, reprocessed fuel, we would still have a lot of this material around for pretty much as long as we can expect our society to exist. So we still have, even if we do go this route of reprocessing, there is still good reason to find a deep geologic repository and put this stuff away. So that's why I think it's important, and I'll elaborate on that a little bit later on. The pictures here are of a dry storage facility, which is the way the CANDU fuel is stored. So they are actually, CANDU fuels are stored indoors in dry storage containers after they have been taken out of the fuel pool. And the bottom left-hand picture there is of a CANDU fuel pool. I used to take people around reactors and show them fuel pools. And it's a real shame that we can't do that nowadays, because the public is terrified of used nuclear fuel and is convinced that, you know, it's somehow going to cause the world to end. And you take them in to look at at the fuel stored at the bottom of a pool, and they kind of point at it and go, "Is that it?" I say, "That." So the shielding of the water between you and that fuel is enough to prevent any radiation from reaching you, and that you are perfectly safe standing here and watching it as long as that water is in the pool. And then they say, well, you know, presumably if I got in the pool, I'd die instantly. No, wouldn't be a good idea, because the pool is not just water, it's got other things in it to keep it clean, and they wouldn't be very good for your skin. But you could swim around on the surface of that pool if you so wanted to, if you were protected from it. So it gives people an understanding that, you know, when they read about used nuclear fuel, it is made out to be this really dangerous material, and people say, well, if you were exposed to it, you would die instantly. So yeah, but if you jump in a fire, you die instantly. The way that you don't die is you don't jump in the fire, and the same is true of used fuel. Handled correctly, it's not a problem. We do have quite a lot of it, though. So our fuel bundles are smaller, as I pointed out earlier on, but we have about 3 million used fuel bundles already in Canada. More than that now, these figures are slightly old. It actually occupies a very small area, even though that sounds like a lot of bundles. And we tend to talk about hockey rinks filled to the boards, and it's something like 5 hockey rinks filled to the boards or something, which tries to contextualize it. So in the overall scheme of things, it occupies a tiny area. We are still producing, and over the lifetime of the existing nuclear fleet, we believe that we will be disposing of 5.5 million fuel bundles. We're currently producing them at a rate of about 90,000 used fuel bundles a year. And we have we have a program that was estimated in 2015 to be about $23.6 billion to build a repository and to load the fuel into it. I always thought that the expensive part would be the building of the repository, but actually it's the loading of the fuel, the transport and the loading of the fuel that costs most of the money.
Could I ask a question at this point, just a quickie?
Yeah.
Oak Ridge, back in the 40s, I believe, built what are called waste burners. And I was wondering if that technology would provide some energy as well as burn up some of the waste. I understand the need for repositories, particularly for mixed fuels, which are just too contaminated with too many different things. But for basic used fuel, why couldn't we use the waste burner technology that Oak Ridge developed?
So I'm not familiar with the waste burner technology that Oak Ridge produced. I would have be very surprised if they didn't produce energy from it, because the processes you've been using would release energy, so it would make sense to do so.
Oh yes, I didn't mean that they didn't produce energy. They did, but they just didn't need it very much at Oak Ridge at the time.
Yep.
It was during World War II. They were just most interested in making plutonium, and so they just used the waste to make plutonium. But nonetheless, it was consuming the waste, and so they were busy making bombs back in World War II. But it was still called a waste burner, and so that's my question: could we not make? You're talking about the costs and so on. Could we not make some waste burners and get a little benefit while we're burning up the darn stuff?
Well, that is indeed what Moltex and ARC are trying to do in their programs on the East Coast. So yes, you can do that. We have just doing the mental math though, go back to what we were talking about earlier. If we've got 95% of the energy remaining in the used fuel, and you start using waste burners, how quickly are you going to go through our 3 million bundles of existing fuel when you get, an order of magnitude more energy out of them than you've already got from them? So you still need a repository because you're never going to get through.
Oh, absolutely.
We can reduce the volumes by doing it, but we're still going to need a repository.
I have no objection to a repository. I think it's essential for all the reasons you said. But I just wanted to reduce the volume a bit.
Yeah, and really, the challenge has been that historically we've needed to for the designs that we've had, we've needed to reprocess in this very precise way, pulling out very accurately the fractions and that we can use to produce energy while leaving behind poisons that would slow that up. And that's meant aqueous reprocessing, which is very prone to it requires large areas, lots of pipe work, it has the potential for leaks, and it's expensive. So the UK had a program where it was trying to reprocess fuel for use. Very expensive, not very effective. Economically, it's never made sense because the world's got plenty of uranium in it, and it's relatively cheap. As I say, the new processes where you can consume the used fuel without the same degree of reprocessing can be done in much smaller plants. It can be done electrochemically and doesn't have the same capacity for leakage or loss from the plant. So exciting things could happen if they can make that work. And we could see it become economically viable where it was never really economically viable in the past. So all these things are possible. It's all down to money and whether it makes sense to do it.
Thank you. Continue.
For Deep Geologic Repository, this is just pulling words out of the Nuclear Waste Management Organization, needs to be big enough to manage all of that, the fuel that's going to be produced. And the commitment that the Nuclear Waste Management Organization have given is, and it may be in their mandate, that no foreign used fuel will be placed in the repository. So it will be entirely for fuel that has become used fuel as a result of its use in Canada. You may have seen recently in the newspapers, there is a revelation of a commercial scheme that might import fuel. And that came out recently and has created a lot of discussion. It was in the way that newspapers do described as being a secretive scheme where, my response to that on LinkedIn is, nobody is going to keep a deep geologic repository secret. The public is going to be involved. The real reason is probably that it wasn't well enough developed yet to tell anyone about it. So, and not a conspiracy, a cock up, really, I think is the response there.
Okay.
So this is the approach that we are taking. Because the fuel bundles are relatively short, we can put them in less well-developed primary storage facilities, constructions. So we're going to be using a commercial pipe that will be copper coated by spray coating the copper on the outside, allowing a much thinner copper barrier that creates some of the corrosion resistance. That'll then be capped and creating a quite solid primary containment. Well, the primary containment is the fuel itself. The secondary containment is the bundle. The tertiary containment is this piping with a steel pipe with a 3mm copper coating that will provide corrosion resistance. And then that will be put into a bentonite clay box. And bentonite clay has a great advantage of being a self-sealing clay. So if for some reason it cracks and you get water ingress, it will then swell to prevent any further water from accessing the copper coating. So copper coating is to prevent corrosion if water gets there. The bentonite will prevent water actually getting there. And then we're going to put it in rock 500 meters underground, in which water is barely flowing anyway. So it's
question. Sorry to keep barging you with questions, but
no, please do.
It differs from our thoughts about using vitrification, and I can gather I kind of like your idea over vitrification. Could you elaborate on cost and advantages of using the clay?
The clay isn't replacing vitrification. Vitrification is another approach, typically used after reprocessing to make the fuel itself back into a solid, but a very a corrosion-proof solid. So we're looking at this as I think an economic approach that has enough safety barriers that you can actually put the fuel without processing it directly into the repository with the additional barriers.
Sounds like a great idea.
But you wouldn't think that from the way that people respond to it. So one of the sites is on near the Bruce power reactors. It makes a lot of sense to do it that because there's a lot of fuel already stored there, and it also has an appropriate geology. It has an appropriate geology, but it is physically located quite close to to a Great Lake. And there are a lot of people saying that we shouldn't put used fuel anywhere near a Great Lake, even though the water that can be found in this rock has never been anywhere near the Great Lake throughout pretty much the whole history of mankind and most of the history of the Earth. Right? It is water cannot flow from it into the Great Lakes because it's not going in that direction. Right. So that's one of the big debates that is taking place at the moment, and a lot of bizarre discussion about that because the used fuel is already stored on the shores of the Great Lakes in the power stations. So you're actually moving it much further away from the Great Lakes than it is currently. And if it's okay currently, why isn't it going to be okay if we move it further away? But logic does not come into this. So. The challenge, obviously there's a challenge to find the right geology, but that's relatively easy. We've got plenty of quite long-lived rock in Canada, and we've got plenty of space, so those aren't problems. There is a commitment from the Nuclear Waste Management Organization that it will be in a willing and an informed and willing host community. So one of the social challenges that we have to understand is what an informed and willing host community actually is, because that was never actually defined. So NWMO are doing work on trying to work out what an informed and willing host community is, as well as trying to find one. Yeah. And the other, which I think is a challenge, is that the community would have the right to withdraw at any point up until all the documents are signed. And so that means that you can go quite a long way down a route of believing you found the right site and then find at the last moment that you don't have access to it. So Nuclear Waste Management Organization took the approach that if they had to have a willing community, they should find out what communities might be willing. So they started a process where they offered people the opportunity to get in touch with them and say, we might be interested. And they did that, and they had 22 original sites across the country, reaching as far over as Saskatchewan, in which communities came forward and said, we're interested in finding out what having a nuclear waste management, a deep geologic repository might mean to our community and the consequences of it. And they started talking with all of those communities to find out how willing they were, and also to start doing geological work on the promising ones to see whether that if they were willing, whether it would be an appropriate place to cite a deep geologic repository. Now that ended up with where we are today, which is leaving us with only 2 potential sites. Both of them in Ontario, one in Northern Ontario in a place called Ignace, and the other near the Bruce plant, as I mentioned previously, in South Bruce. So we have slimmed it down from 22 to 2. And in the near future, they will be hopefully deciding one of those is a willing community and selecting that in order to move forward with, in order to develop our deep geologic repository project. How is it looking? Well, anybody that's dealt with the nuclear industry will know that there are a lot of people that are against having it nearby. And so I've just picked up some of the newspaper articles that are being published about it and some of the events that are taking place. Now, this is one of the protests against it. There are a number of groups that are arguing that it is not safe, but really they are community NIMBY groups, and largely comprised of people who would have the facility in their backyard. And, you know, whilst I wouldn't want to impose a facility on anyone, governments routinely do impose things on people. They have to build roads, they have to build other infrastructure, and we have to get used to the fact that sometimes we have to tolerate that infrastructure being built near us. The unfortunate thing is that the NIMBY campaigns don't admit that they're NIMBY campaigns. They try and incite people to be anti-nuclear because it helps in the NIMBY campaign. So you get lots of statements being made about nuclear that are unhelpful, that aren't really truthful, but they are just supporting those campaigns. What are the problems? So the things that they tend to build into their arguments are, one, that the used fuel is dangerous for a long time. And I write a lot about this, but I try and, well, I tell people it's a nonsense argument, that a lot of things we have are dangerous for a long time. The uranium that we dug out of the ground in the first place was radioactive when we dug it up, and it will be radioactive when the Earth is consumed in a fireball when the sun explodes. So the fact that something has long-lived radioactivity is a complete irrelevance. It is what happens to it that is an issue. But people don't make that transition in their mind. They just say, oh, this is a very long time. It's dangerous for a very long time. Therefore, I don't think we can keep it safe for a very long time. So that's one of the sort of mental expansions that they take from their lived experience and impose upon something that where it doesn't really apply. And the other is this idea that people have that radioactivity is unsafe at any dose. And so I've picked up here, this is Helen Caldecott, who is a anti-nuclear physician from Australia, who bizarrely flies around the world trying to convince people that all radiation is dangerous and all of it has to be stopped. The reason I say that it's rather bizarre is that when she gets in a plane and flies, she exposes herself to an awful lot more radiation than typically radiation workers expose themselves to. And therefore, she clearly doesn't believe her own rhetoric, because if she did, she wouldn't be getting in planes and exposing herself to radiation. But she does manage to convince a lot of people that they need to be scared of radiation because it's unsafe at any dose. Actually, the statistics clearly demonstrate that that is, in any case, not the truth, and that low doses of radiation statistically are very unlikely to cause you any harm, certainly less harm than almost anything else that you do in your or other things that we regularly do in our lives. So those are the two challenges that they have to overcome. And I am a great fan of a social scientist from the UK, a guy called Malcolm Grimston, who I've seen speak a number of times. And he has said, you know, that the challenge with getting the message across about deep geologic repositories is that our response to people being scared about used nuclear fuel is to tell them that we're going to bury it underground, we're going to put it in bentonite boxes, we're going to, before we put it in the bentonite box, we're going to put it in a steel pipe with copper, as I have just done. And actually all we're doing is we're scaring people more and more, because we seem to be having to take these tremendous measures to protect them against the used nuclear fuel. So he said they're behaving quite rationally because it's the nuclear industry that's scaring them. So I've been trying to suggest to people that we might take a different approach to talking with people about these issues. And I wrote a number of articles on LinkedIn under the headline, 10 Reasons Why the Nuclear Industry Cannot Bury Its Used Fuel Problem. And it was a deliberately deceptive title in order to draw out how deliberately deceptive titles work. So a lot of anti-nuclear people would have clicked on this to say, oh, this is going to be telling me, you know, why it's so dangerous to do it, where actually the 10 reasons why the nuclear industry can't bury its used fuel problem is that the problem isn't the used fuel. The problem is people's understanding of used fuel. And so immediately it introduces that as a subject and starts talking about used fuel in different ways to that which the nuclear industry has done. Richard, I'm completely ignorant of the time. How much time do I have left?
It's 11:25. We have until noon. And this is usually we start to slow down about now, but there's 35 free minutes. And I think you've given such a great provocative talk that I imagine there are lots of people out there with still more questions. I see a couple already, and I have a bunch still. How are you fixed? Are you okay?
So what I'm going to do then is I'm going to flick, because people can read the articles. I'm going to go through these very quickly with just the 10 points.
Okay.
And rather than elaborate on them, and then people are aware they're there if they want to read them at their leisure. That's another point. But I'll pick up on the major points. So the first is the one we've talked about. So people will fixate on the fact that it takes 240,000 years for plutonium to be considered safe. Well, so what? It's not actually true. We already have a world in which we have plutonium contamination. Some years ago, we used to drop lots of bombs to test them, and we plastered plutonium all over the world. The fact that it is very long-lived is not the relevant issue. So that's the first thing. I'm trying to take away this differentiating feature of time from the issue and get people to understand it's not the time, it's the consequences that are the issue. So whenever somebody says it's long-lived, it's going to take 100,000 years become itself before it comes safe, that's totally irrelevant. And in fact, the other argument I use there is that a lot of the materials that we use in solar panels and in windmills are actually unsafe forever because they don't radioactively decay. They are toxins. They are toxins now. They will always be toxins. the lifetime of the toxin is an irrelevance. It's whether you expose yourself to it that is an issue. So that's the first point I try and get across.
Could I ask, make another quick point?
Mm-hmm.
Those toxins that you just talked about are silent toxins. The beauty of radiotoxicity is that you can pick it up with a Geiger counter.
In very, very low quantities. So you have one radioactive emission, one radioactive. Remembering a mole is 6 times 10 to the 23, right? And that's a small cube of carbon. You know, one emission, and you can pick it up and know that you've got radiation there. It's tremendous. Whereas, as you say, so you can walk out in a field and determine where radiation is. In order to detect whether you've got any niobium that has leached out of your windmill and has reached the soil, you have to do very complicated chemical tests that might tell you parts per million, possibly parts per billion, but are very, very crude in comparison. So you're absolutely right. And it's one of the advantages of radiation, but it's also one of the disadvantages because people can find it very easily, whereas they would remain blissfully ignorant of these other toxins and not worry about them because they didn't know about them. So the other is the idea that it's very, very dangerous stuff and it's too hot to handle. And so this is a picture that of just saying, well, we handle it all the time. You know, we know what level of shielding is needed. Once inside that shielding, you can go and stand next to it. So here is a picture of a guy standing next to actually American dry storage containers, and he is under no threat from the used fuel that's contained therein, despite the fact that it has produced huge quantities of energy. So it's trying to get away from the idea that you can't handle this stuff and get people to understand we handle it all the time and it's not causing any harm. Then there's this idea that people have that we shouldn't put anything that's radioactive into the earth. Well, the third point is the Earth's already radioactive. In fact, as we go deeper and deeper into the Earth, we know that the center of the Earth is still molten when it should have cooled millennia ago. And the belief is that that has to be as a result of radioactive emissions. And therefore, we're sitting on a very, very radioactive core. And we also know, because we mine radioactive materials, that there are already deposits that are very rich in radioactive materials. So we're not fundamentally changing anything if we put anything back. And as we said earlier, most of what's in that fuel rod is what we dug out of the ground in the first place. Only a tiny fraction of it is stuff that we've changed. So we're not really doing anything different to the Earth than has already happened. And then people say, well, we don't know what will happen to the geology. You know, it might have been stable for the past 10 billion years, but tomorrow morning, something might change and the geology might suddenly turn into a mountain that pops up in the middle of Ontario unexpectedly, and the fuel rod will pop to the surface. And so, well, one, this is very unlikely. Two, we might have other problems if that happened. But three, so what? You know, all you have to do to make it safe again is put it back in its shielding. And you can do that by, you know, using a shielded vehicle. Nowadays, where you have remote handling, you wouldn't have to go anywhere near it. So you just don't live near it for a while, and then you go and pour some concrete on it. It's not a fundamental problem. You can fix it. The fifth is this idea that you know, no parts of the world should be made toxic. Well, there are vast tracts of the Earth that are toxic. I would argue that, you know, the seas are toxic to mankind because they've got too much salt in the water. We don't worry about them too much. We just don't live in them. But there are other areas. There are sulfur caves. There are calcite deposits, all of which are completely toxic to life. And the way that life deals with them is it doesn't live near them. So I'm trying to get across this idea that the world's not a perfect place in the first place. So doing a little bit of harm to it, if you have to, it isn't really that much of a problem. And then to try and get across to people how big a space that we're talking about. So, you know, people's lived experiences on the geosphere, it's on the surface of the Earth. But when we go underneath the Earth, we're talking about vast tracts of land, of the planet that have never previously been accessed. And that's where we're going if we build a deep geologic repository. So we're not damaging any of the ecosystem, because we're not in the ecosystem. We're well below the ecosystem in a part of the Earth that doesn't communicate with it. And there is lots of it. In terms of the assessments, one of the things people don't understand is to say, well, you know, in 100,000 years, this may happen. And that is part of the way that the nuclear industry has gone about creating its safety case for deep geologic repositories, where it says, you know, we will take the worst case of everything and add them all up so that, you know, we've monitored the water flow, and it is between this tiny amount and this slightly more than tiny amount. So we will assume that overall it is this slightly more, because that was the worst case. And then they will look at the corrosion on the copper, and they'll say, well, it could be in this range. We will take the worst case. They then look at, you know, the water penetration within the bentonite clay. Do the same thing. They take the worst case. So the safety cases are built upon the worst case, the worst case, the worst case, the worst case, all the way down the line. Not really acknowledging that almost none of these things are likely to happen, and that 99 million out of whatever times, those aren't going to happen. So it's much, much safer than it appears to be. Although we do have to plan for the worst case, chances are it won't be the worst case. So Murphy's law doesn't always apply, and it will definitely not always apply in this case. There's a lot of people, this is point 8, a lot of people worried that we might go back into a repository and as a result cause ourselves harm from unexpectedly going into a repository. Well, going back to 6, statistically, it's very unlikely that somebody's going to accidentally drill into a repository simply on the statistical grounds that there is so much area that they could be drilling into, and we're putting it in rock that doesn't have any other value at the moment. So it's unlikely anybody that is wanting to go back into it. And there's lots of obsession with, well, but we should still mark this land so that people know what we've done. And that's, well, if you walk back into a repository the day after it closes, it will be as safe as the day before it closes. As long as the shielding is still in place, then you will be able to walk around in the repository. And after it closes, that will still be the case. So it is nowhere near the danger that people accept. And I also point out to people that in theorizing about the potential for someone going back into the repository and not knowing what it is, you have to assume they have the capacity to drill 500 meters into deep rock, but have forgotten how to make machines that monitor radiation, because otherwise they would very quickly understand that radiation was there and be able to deal with the problem. So again, going back to point 7, not a very likely scenario. Possible that some future creature does have the capacity to mine, but hasn't discovered radiation yet, but very unlikely that that would be the case. 9 says, you know, everybody believes that if something did go wrong, there'd be nothing we can do about it. Well, actually, if something does go wrong, it would be an economic disaster. But from an ecological point of view, we have the capacity to go in and fix it. While we still have a developed society, we are clever enough to do that. So you can discount that problem. And then the final one was the point that I started with about the fact that some people say we don't need a deep geologic repository. We could keep it all. We are going to use the materials in used fuel at some point, so we may as well keep it on the surface. And my point there is, yes, but over the time periods we're talking about, we are still going to have used fuel that we need to deal with. It makes sense to build a repository. If we really need the energy from it, we can go back in, but the chances are there's so much energy there that we won't need to do that. And then for fans of Spinal Tap, there is always a 0.11. So I'm turning the volume up to 11 here. And that is just because it's safe. This is my favorite slide, by the way. I want to share this one with you. In Saskatchewan, they have a children's festival every year. And one of the mining companies there just dumps a whole load of shale. And the kids go through it looking for fossils. And when I first got there, they said, you might find some shark teeth. And I thought, probably one child every year finds a shark tooth. We actually found in an hour of sifting through the rock, 12 shark teeth. And I don't mean fossilized shark teeth. I mean shark teeth that you can take out of, we held in our hands and you could cut paper with. They were still so sharp. And they were in rock that was 70 million years old. And it wasn't even rock, it was shale. So that shows how deep underground things happen very, very, very slowly. So that's the most powerful thing is used fuel is currently in an environment where politics changes, sociology changes, the environment changes, everything changes in a very short timescale. Deep underground, everything happens very, very, very slowly. So because we don't know what's going to happen on the surface and never can, we don't know how long our societies are going to last. If we truly want to be responsible for managing our ecosphere, we should be getting on and putting this stuff underground now, because when society starts to collapse, we may not remember to get on and do it, or we might not have the capacity to do it. So the time to do it is when you know you can do it, and that's now. So that's my final argument for why we should build a GGR. And I think, what I'm trying to get across is a lot of the issues aren't around the technology issues. They're about getting to people understand why we should do it, and the fact that we're not doing anything that's that unusual, and we shouldn't differentiate it from everything else that's been done, because it's in many ways very, very similar. And I think, so I finished with a slide that says, so I love talking about nuclear stuff. So I hope I've been sufficiently provided some useful information to give some people some things to think about. And I'm now happy to chat about whatever nuclear issues you might want to raise.
I'm just delighted with how this hour and a half has gone, Neil. I think you've covered so many interesting questions, both the public questions, the questions that pertain to Canada and the UK. And I'm delighted as a former resident of Canada, especially to catch up on a lot of these things. We do have Mert Corwin's question that we were going to talk about. I think you pretty much dealt with it, but let me just rephrase that again to make sure we have. He says, how can the world help the general public relate to the positive aspects and the safety of radiation through their exposure to medical isotopes? I guess you've answered that, but just in case you have any other comments to add to that, and then I have a couple more questions.
Yeah, I think it's, for me, it's about familiarity and comfort. People are comfortable with things in their lived experience, and somehow nuclear energy takes them out of their lived experience, and so they become uncomfortable with it. I think the great benefit of medical isotopes and the medical uses of radioactivity are that it makes people understand that it is not that unusual, and it is not that scary, and that we're handling it all of the time. And for me, it's not just about medical isotopes, although that's probably the most obvious one. I actually give a presentation on, I call it a day in the life. And the idea is that I go through a day talking about the number of times in an ordinary life you bump up against the use of radioactive materials. And I end with the argument that we could not run a modern society without the radioactive materials that have come out of the nuclear industry and our understanding of nuclear science. So, it starts very simply. I walk out of my bedroom door and I stare straight at a smoke detector that contains americium-241, that has a 240-year half-life. It is chemically and radioactively very similar to plutonium. And so a lot of anti-nuclear people would say, well, that's so unsafe that we've got to lock it out of the environment for, until it becomes safe in 2,400 years' time. It isn't safe in 2,400, it's still toxic, but we'll go along with that argument. So, well, we can either do that or we can use it as a smoke detector in our houses, where it is such an important contribution to saving human life that you are mandated to have one in almost every civilized country. Yeah. Right. And so is it that scary? No, it's not. I'm using it. And then I talk about buildings. We use radioactive sources to inspect the welds on tall buildings and bridges. It's what keeps us safe. So we use it in that environment. We use tritium in perpetual lights, so that if there's an emergency and the lights go off, typically, if there's a fire, then you lose your electrical system, the lights go out. They provide exit signs that allow people the way out. Tritium, people will argue that's a very difficult material to handle, and yet it is used routinely throughout our everyday life. You will see tritiated signs. We still have tritiated watches. They even actually still use tritium in children's toys for glow-in-the-dark toys, because for the people that know, they know it does so little harm that the fun that you get out of it exceeds the potential damage that it could ever do. We use radioactive materials to make sure that our cans, that a can is full or a bottle is full. We use it to discharge static when we're making newspapers and the printing presses are running materials over each other. We use it to detect water in soils in order to make sure that our agriculture is effectively as possible. We use cobalt-60 sources to irradiate surgical instruments to make sure our operations are safe. We also irradiate foods with it. So things like spices that may be containing quite serious pathogens that could make us quite sick are treated with radiation to remove those pathogens. We are entirely dependent upon radioactive materials, and yet the nuclear industry has not gone out and told people about it, so that they hear about a radioactive material and they're scared of it because they're unfamiliar with its use in everyday life. And it's there all of the time, it's all around us, and it's managed correctly, causes no harm.
Thank you for that great answer. I like you, encounter that in a slightly different perspective as a radiation oncologist. And for 20 years, I would see patients who were referred to me for radiation therapy to parts of their body, if they had lymphomas and Hodgkin's disease or breast cancer and other sites, brain cancers, lung cancers, and they would, I never asked them if they were afraid of radiation, because we both knew that they were terrified of the cancer, and radiation suddenly became their friend, is to help them fight off this scourge of cancer, and it changed the whole picture around. So I didn't have to worry too much about that. But I'm sure when they first got under the linear accelerator, they had some fears as they saw that big machine going around them. But they have been fortunately educated by many of us in the medical and paramedical industry to understand and appreciate what that linear accelerator was for. I'm gonna take the prerogative of asking you a pet question that has bothered me for some time, and I've not had a good answer yet. You talked about triso pebbles being used as a type of fuel, and in your background, I know you've had some experience with them, and they're used in the very high temperature reactors that some people have proposed using still. They've been used twice in Germany, not with good effects, and there was some overheating and melting at the bottom because those pebbles got caught in the piping. And in both times in Germany, they had some costly and not yet finished cleanup jobs to do with those pebble bed reactors, and yet we're still talking about it. And I'm a little bothered by their ability to be recycled. I know that can be done, and you can harvest perhaps some of the fuel. But if you could compare those with molten salt reactors, which strike me as having so many advantages over the pebble bed reactors, just give me your thoughts, if you would, to the group. I know it's a little off topic, but I'd love to have someone with your breadth of experience instead of people that I listen to who are pushing one or the other technology, to help me understand those two generation 4 type reactors that we may be dealing with in the future.
Yeah, so the first is a sort of very generic answer, and that is that whenever you talk to any technology enthusiast, they have a tendency to remember the good things about their technology, but
Yes.
don't remember the challenges
Yes.
in quite the same level of detail. So there are problems for any technology. TRISO has its challenges that it needs to overcome. It has some benefits, it has some disadvantages. Molten salt reactors similarly have some benefits and some disadvantages. So, you know, one of the challenges that they've got to overcome with the molten salt reactors are the corrosion issues. So, you know, molten salts tend to be quite corrosive. Also, when you have your chamber filled with molten salt, it's quite difficult to inspect the corrosion. So you're not as aware of what's going on as in other systems. And that may not be a problem, because you could be able to prove it scientifically as to what level of corrosion is taking place. But regulators tend to like to be able to inspect. So it may not be a fundamental problem, but it could be a real problem as people try and deal with those things. As I pointed out to other molten salt reactors, they have another bit of a challenge because they've got a fuel that's moving around and around. So they have an awful lot to convince regulators about in order to prove to the regulator that there's no circumstance in which something adverse and unpredictable is happening.
Okay.
TRISO fuels, as you say, you know, once you've made a TRISO fuel, it's a very, so for what people, in case people don't know, it's like a billiard ball sized fuel containment of a ceramic. So it's very, very hard, very, very high temperature tolerance. And the idea being that if you lost all coolant to the fuel, even though it continues to heat up through radioactive decay, it could never get to a temperature where the integrity is breached, because its emissivity rises so much that it's giving out more heat than it is being generated. So you always have integrity around your fuel pellet. But it does mean that the ceramic is very, very hard, so you can never get back into the fuel. So the idea of reprocessing kind of goes out of the window, but what you've got instead is a primary, hopefully a primary containment that is so good that you can waive a lot of the other safety features of the reactor and ensure that you can never end up with a nasty incident. So molten salt and TRISO bring different opportunities to the industry for dealing with different problems and in different ways. I think it'll be very interesting to see. It's a bit like VHS and Betamax for people of my sort of age. You know,
Yeah.
different technologies delivering the same purpose. The public economics, timing, the aggressiveness of the personalities involved will likely have more sway on which one is successful than the technology itself.
Okay, thank you for that. My comment about molten salt reactors is that is such a frequently raised issue, the internal corrosion, and yet I'm told that if oxygen is removed from the system, which can easily be done, that the corrosion is greatly minimized. And surely we can model this sort of thing so that we can understand it and appreciate better. I understand some of that is being done here at the University of Wisconsin, but I haven't heard the last details of that. But I find myself much more attracted to getting rid of the fuel rods and just having it as a liquid form. It seems to me to be inherently so much easier to manage, although I realize that you do contaminate some of the pipes by having the fuel in the salt itself, and so that does require some careful decommissioning. I'll be interested to hear what our speaker next week, Robert Hargraves, has to say about that. He's a founder of Thorcon, and I hope that you might come and join us, Neil, in asking him some questions. I've asked him to focus on what they're doing in Indonesia because I think that's so exciting. The possibility of short-circuiting a number of coal plants that would be built there, and their need to increase energy as part of the third world. It would be wonderful if we could use some nuclear reactors instead of coal plants.
If I may, it's one of the points I make to a lot of people that excuse me, historically, pollution has typically been a local issue, possibly a national issue. We came across one circumstance of a really international pollution issue, and that was the fluorocarbons. And luckily, there was a fairly easy technological fix, so the world was able to come together and fix that.
With the Montreal Protocol.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Greenhouse gases are an international problem, but there isn't an easy fix.
Yeah.
But the challenge that I see at the moment is that we are still trying to deal with them as national issues. Yeah. And so we try and reduce our carbon footprint. And quite regularly, all that means is the carbon footprint moves somewhere else. Mm-hmm. And we don't actually solve the problem. Or we spend vast quantities of money trying to make ourselves feel better about solving our carbon footprint when the money would have been much better spent helping somebody else solve theirs. So the reason I say that is that one of the big challenges the world has is that the population is expanding, and it's not just expanding, but the population that is enjoying the developed world's lifestyle is increasing dramatically. So it was pointed out to me to a colleague of mine that I can't remember the exact figures, but something like 15 of the 20 biggest cities in the world in 20 years' time will be in Africa. They will be cities that we don't even consider as cities at the moment, but they are expanding dramatically. And they will expand, right? You cannot say to them, we want you to remain a poor nation. That's not an option that we have. And if they have to use fossil fuels to do it, they will use fossil fuels to do it. So one of the things the developed world needs to get its head around is making sure that we are delivering solutions to them that they can use. So that's why, I picked up on the Indonesia issue. Too much of our thinking is going, how do we build a few windmills nearby? Ain't going to make any difference. We need to make sure that we are delivering solutions that will allow those nations to develop without going through the phase of using fossil fuels, because what they do will affect us. And I'm very disappointed that what to me seems to be a very, very obvious point is not being recognized by any of our governments. And I can only assume that it is because their immediate concern is to get voted in. And helping other people doesn't get them voted in. So I think the world needs to change its understanding and realize that if we're going to solve the problem, we've got to look at where the problem is moving to and help them have a way of achieving their objectives without doing it the way that we did it.
Very well put.
It's my soapbox issue, right?
I think it's a great issue, one that Alex Canara brings out in one of his graphs, that we as developed nations don't have to worry too much but the other countries that don't have the developing countries that don't have our energy are going to be needing it, and let's help them out. But as you point out, it's not always a politically supported idea. At least the people of Indonesia apparently have been consulted, and they are much more in favor of Thorcon equipment being installed instead of coal plants, as I understand, than most Americans, and I'm possibly Canadians too. Which kind of leads me to another minor point. How was it that the Canadians were so receptive to this huge nuclear plant on Lake Huron when about 20 reactors under development in the United States over the last few decades of the 20th century were canceled? How is it that did the people in Ontario just have a lot of faith in Ontario Hydro and figure, well, they do a good job with nuclear? How is Canada or Ontario so successful?
So I wasn't here at the time, and I can't answer that question with any confidence.
Yeah.
However, there's a sort of stand back and look at things approach that I sometimes take, and I go, France had a very successful nuclear program because it had no other choice.
Yes.
And Ontario may have had a very successful nuclear program because it had no other choice, right? So, if you don't have people coming along and say, well, you should build a coal-fired power station because that's going to be cheaper, because actually shipping in the coal is going to be so expensive, then you say, okay, what's my other option? My other option is nuclear. Let's go ahead and make that work then. But I suspect, at the time it was an era of a belief in technology, a lot of the existing cynicism that the world has now. Although we embrace it, we like to criticize it. That didn't exist. People had a faith in technologists that perhaps doesn't exist any longer, and that was probably a contribution as well. And then, of course, we have the fact that CANDU plants were clearly better than anything you were building in America.
That's a good answer. I accept that one. Speaking of different countries, everybody wonders about the dichotomy between France and Germany, and people have asked, well, how is it that those two countries reacted, the population, so differently in accepting what the government proposed? And I think some people say that Germany was guilty because they really started to develop a bomb before we did. And we were sort of rushing with them with the Manhattan Project because we were afraid they would develop it before us. And whereas France had a different people, the French people believe, some people say, that they discovered it in the first place with Curie and Becquerel and all of those pioneers of radioactivity. And so they felt it was as much their discovery as it was ours in the United States. So there's that different perspective on the public.
We could talk for hours on this subject because I think it speaks to national psychologies, and governments, and all sorts of issues. It turns out that whilst we feared the Germans might have started a bomb program in advance of the Allies, it appears that if they did, it was not going to be successful, and they hadn't made anywhere near the progress that anyone thought they might have. There is a story that which I believe to be true, although it may not have as profound an effect as people suggest it might have, and that is that the first French reactor was actually built on the French-German border. And there were large protests in which a protester ended up getting shot, and the protester was German. And therefore, the French, who hate the Germans, immediately said, well, this must be a good thing Germans die as a result of it.
Oh, dear.
And the Germans said, this must be a bad thing because the French like it. And
oh, dear. I hope that's wrong, but you never know. As I understand it, there's not that much antipathy between the French and the Germans. It was only the Nazis that led to a temporary concern, but I think now the countries are pretty well adjusted to one another. But you're right, back in the past, there may have been a problem. It is unfortunately 12 o'clock, and I would like to just finish off by pointing out a comment from Dr. Bulent Attalay, who has been watching this and attending, and he said, "I would like to commend Dr. Alexander on a compelling lecture, illuminating and inspiring." And I highly endorse your comment, Bulent, and thank you very, very much, Neil, for Alexander, for your great presentation today. I deeply appreciate it and look forward to your contributing as a discussant with us in some of our future talks.
I'm looking forward to that as well. It's been
Okay.
great. I hadn't realized so much time had passed. So
Yes, 2 hours are a lot of fun, and
I have
I've thoroughly enjoyed it.
certainly enjoyed myself, and it just leaves me to thank everyone for giving me their time and listening to me. I really appreciate it.
That's great. Okay, well, thanks again. We'll see you all next week, and hopefully we can have a different but educational and inspiring talk from Robert Hargraves. So bye-bye, everyone. See you next week.
Goodbye then.
Bye-bye.